Good evening and welcome. Tonight, I'm delighted to welcome Ron Trewyn on the line, and he is the author of this fascinating book called Vietnam's War of Hate. I think it's going to be a fascinating discussion. But before we get into that, a little bit of administration. If you could please, if you have any questions for Ron, put them in the Q&A at the bottom, and as usual, I will read them out. And as always, we must give a big thank out to our funders, the Armed Forces Covenant Fund Trust. Thank you. Ron, thank you so much for joining us from the US of A.
My pleasure. Happy to be here.
So I enjoyed this book, right? As I said beforehand, and actually it was quite a surprising book because this is not about war stories, is it?
Very little. It leads off a little bit that way, but that truly is not the real function of it. No.
So this, I think the book kind of really starts when you came back home, doesn't it?
It does. I came back from Vietnam, unbelievably proud of my service and proud of all of those I served with over there. It was a life-changing experience, and to be treated unfavorably, to be condemned for having served there and served honorably, as the vast majority of those who served there did, was a shock. It was very hard. It was harder than combat for me. And so that sort of motivated me to eventually to try to tell. Initially, the thought was just tell that first year story of coming back, what it was like, and obviously then evolved into something longer.
So one of the things that you say in the beginning of the book, well, you mentioned this several times, I think it's fair to say, is that the first 8 to 10 months back in the US were the most difficult of your life, I think, as you say a few times.
Yes.
Can you just elaborate on why that was the case?
Uh, and that's one of those things. It's truly hard to put into words and to explain to somebody who hasn't ever been in combat. The To back up a little bit, no one knows. Everyone is trained the same to go into combat. No one knows until the first firefight how they're going to react in combat. You can be trained all the same way, but until someone is trying to kill you, you don't know how you're going to react and how it's going to evolve. Uh, that experience and being surrounded by brothers all willing to die for the person next to them, all of them, uh, maybe with one exception, but essentially it was everyone there. It is such a humbling experience, such a moving experience, and to then come home and be treated like garbage, and to them suggest that you shouldn't be proud of your service, that you should be ashamed of having gone, and condemning it and siding with the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong, which many of the protesters were by. It was truly orders of magnitude harder for me than being in combat, and I truly came within an eyelash of quitting school. I was in my last year of undergraduate work of quitting school and going back in the Army, and I would have volunteered to go back to Vietnam, even knowing I likely wouldn't survive. So I, it makes little sense to somebody who's never been in a situation like that, and I can't explain it logically. It is a bit illogical, but it was eating me up what was going on in my hometown in Wisconsin,
Why,
where I
so
was
why didn't you
originally raised.
re-enlist, Ron? Why didn't you re-enlist?
Like I say, was very close to. At about 5 months after getting home, which I actually got out 5 months early. I was only on active duty 19 months total, left with shrapnel 2 inches away from my heart, uh, and still in my left lung. So could have died over there. But I, at 5 months, so about the time I would have gotten out normally, I was ready to go and re-enlist. And at about 5.5 months, the war protesters burned down the main building on the campus where I was finishing the last year of my undergraduate work. It happened to be, that was a teacher's college in Whitewater, Wisconsin. It happened to be the school where I went from kindergarten through my sophomore year in high school. So K-10 of my K-12 years were spent in the building I watched burn on February 7th, 1970. It about halfway through our time of standing at the bottom of the hill watching that, the realization of how it had happened, there was no question in my mind the protesters did it. It made me so angry, I basically said, those bastards aren't going to chase me away. They aren't going to make me leave and go back and die in Vietnam. It's not going to happen. So it was that truly, I think without that, I'm not sure that I wouldn't have re-enlisted.
Hmm. And that was the catalyst that started another fight for you, didn't it?
It kind of did. There were the naivete of some co-eds back in that day was a little bit extreme. Army regulations required to remove all your insignia from your fatigue jackets and everything else, which I had done. I bought a teeny tiny little American flag pin that I put on my lapel of my jacket that I wore. And three different times that first year back, totally different locations, I had three different co-eds explain to me why I shouldn't be wearing the American flag. And if I had any idea what war was all about, I wouldn't be wearing it. Um, that that was a
So
bit unusual.
I think that's probably an understatement. So how did you respond to that, given what you've just done?
Uh, the first two were early enough in the year. I just stood there shaking my head and didn't do anything. By the third one, it was after the old main had burned and I had seen enough of this stuff. And I suggested to that young lady that considering that I had a piece of shrapnel in my left lung, still from Vietnam, I thought I knew a little bit more about war than she did. Uh, she truly got this shocked expression on her face, and I thought she was going to leave because we were at a bar drinking at the time, and I'd never seen her before. But instead, she had to ask me one last question, which was, "What?" And with hate glowing in her eyes. I've never seen hatred like that. Well, one other time since, but this hatred in her eyes, asking me, "What does it take someone like you to kill somebody?" She didn't like my response.
No, and it's not really repeatable tonight, is it? For you, I think we probably can all expect what that might be, but it is in the book if everybody wants to read that. So this would have been what, 1970, did you say?
Yes, 1970.
So at this time, of course, there is a lot of political turmoil going on in the US, which I don't necessarily want to go down that road, but it was a very, well, how would you describe that time?
I mean, the level of hate in the country. I mean, it was unbelievable to me, and the misinformation that was circulating about Vietnam was mind-boggling. I noticed that as soon as I came back, that anything I would see on TV, any write-ups I would see in the paper, or somebody would show me an article from Newsweek or Time or whatnot, it was nothing like what I experienced when I was there. Everything was bogus, and the level of misinformation was unreal. And so those on the anti-war side were just vicious and treated anyone who was a patriot and who had served just like garbage. So it was uh, it was not a pleasant time to be around, and especially on a college campus.
Hmm. So, as you just alluded to, how much did the media, both TV, radio, and obviously printed media, because obviously we're talking pre-internet here, how much of that was influential, do you think? What role did they play in the story?
It was hugely. I mean, that was, I think, a vast majority of it back then. Uh, I came to realize later that the universities were seeding a lot of this hate and problems for the military, but for the Vietnam War, it was the media coverage of the war that was so bogus and so misinforming everybody of what was going on. The one thing in the short time I was in Vietnam, which was only 3.5 months, I truly admired and loved the Vietnamese people. The ones we interacted with, they didn't want the Viet Cong there. They didn't want the North Vietnamese there. They were mostly, we were out in the field. These were rice farmers and villagers and whatnot. Uh, Awesome, awesome individuals. And the things that were being portrayed in the media about them, you would see people saying how pathetic the political people and the people of South Vietnam were. These were just poor peasants in many cases, just trying to survive, and they absolutely did not want the VC there. They didn't want the war going on. They supported the U.S. for the most part. I would have to qualify that by saying if it was an area where the VC visited their villages every night, they couldn't support us because their tax collectors would come in. They would beat the kids when they turned 11, 12 years old, and they would thereby volunteer to be a VC. We knew of cases like that. So it was, but the media was really, really bad, including the major news channels and all the newspaper coverage.
Hmm. So you talk about Walter Cronkite, who's kind of meant to be the, I don't know, a bit of an American icon. I think he's a world icon, to be quite honest. And you were quite critical, I think it's fair to say.
He was quite critical, not only of the war, but of the Vietnamese people generally. Probably there was some corruption in the political system of South Vietnam. Duh. Where isn't there some? But he was also would and talked about on the air about how pathetic the South Vietnamese people were. Well, he had never been there in the villages, interacting with them, with these poor people trying to survive. It was the last thing I would have used to describe them was pathetic, and so and he changed a lot of minds in the country back then. He was sort of the godfather of the news, and so Howard K. Smith was about the only good reporter I could remember from back then, but most of the other major news networks and the coverage was just awful.
Do you think incidents is like, I may be pronouncing this wrong, Marley, obviously the event that happened there?
Neil,
I think I told you I'd get it wrong.
that's all right. That's all right.
Do you think how
Took me a
important
second
were
to
the
figure out
way,
what you were.
sorry, how important do you think the way events like that were reported?
I mean, and that obviously should have been exposed and never should have happened, and was horrible. And the individuals involved should have been court-martialed. I mean, but it was prior to that when all this poor reporting was going on too. That just then really accelerated it from that point on,
Mm.
and it was uh, anybody who came back from Vietnam, not proud of their service, was held up by the protesters and by the news media as a hero. And there were some political figures that came along that were like that.
Mm. So, at what point did you start putting pen to paper or typewriter, however you did it back then?
Uh, it was, geez, what year was that? 87, I think, because of some stuff that was going on uh, at work. I at least I started during Christmas vacation in 87, thinking, I ought to at least develop an outline for this. And I started sort of putting together an outline. And my true belief was that the story I was going to write would be about Vietnam coming home, and it would end in 1970, which obviously the book does not, as you know, having read it. And so that's really when I started at least outlining the general concepts. And then when the university started to mess with me a bit because I asked a simple question, that's when I started spending more time on the book.
So let's talk about that a little bit, please.
Uh, Basically, uh, I was at the time, I was up for promotion to full professor, and I'd been doing cancer research for almost 20 years, or not at that point, but I've been doing cancer research. I was a member of the Comprehensive Cancer Center, had a faculty position in the medical school. I was up for full professor, sort of the last tier, and I had just been asked to chair a search committee in the College of Medicine involving two departments, and they sent me the affirmative action form, the documents of what needed to be done as we went through this hiring process. And I sort of knew back then that I knew the basis for why women and minorities were covered under affirmative action. Until I got that booklet, I didn't realize that Vietnam era veterans were afforded protection, affirmative action protection, and the disabled. I kind of knew about the disabled, but I didn't know the basis. I then had the basis for this. And at that particular time, my university had just launched a $7 million affirmative action campaign to increase the number of women and minorities at the university. So, never being smart enough to keep my mouth shut, uh, I, I wrote a very short, I thought, pleasant letter to the provost where the search was being launched, saying, based on my recent readings of our affirmative action protocols here at Ohio State, shouldn't Vietnam era veterans and the disabled be included in this $7 million affirmative action campaign? I showed it to my chairman of my department to make sure I wasn't being offensive or pushing or doing something wrong. He said, looks fine to me. No problem, send it. 11 days later, Jerry, my chairman, calls me and said, did you send that letter to the provost? I said, yes. Why? He said, that must be it. I said, must be what? The provost just pulled your promotion package and you're being required to jump through additional hoops that nobody else up for full professor has to do. And that's when the war really began for me with the university. I obviously had to behave for a while on advice from my attorney, but it got very, very ugly for a while, and they were truly looking for an excuse not to promote me to full professor, and to say that upset me a bit would be an understatement. And in looking back on it, that essentially ended my cancer research career. I could no longer do battle for an institution that was doing that to me, and I ultimately found the proof that that's what they were up to.
So what happened next in this battle that you'd undertaken, this war you'd started?
Uh, well, once once it, I'll just say first off, they wanted letters of recommendation or letters of reference for me from people who didn't have a clue who I was, which made no sense. And they weren't wanting to send anybody my resume and my CV to show them. And anyhow, it was a real bizarre situation. But finally, just before Memorial Day, they relented. The feedback that came back from people who didn't know me were favorable. I got the word that I was going to be promoted. And so moving forward, the day I signed my contract with the university for full professor, I also had ready to go a complaint to the federal government for discrimination against Vietnam veterans that went in the mail went in the mail slot together, along with letters to lots of other locations. But the Department of Labor was the organization charged with monitoring this particular law from 1974, the Vietnam Era Veterans Readjustment Assistance Act, and so filed that complaint, and the fun began.
So it's important to understand, isn't it, that this is a federal law, it's not a
Yes.
state law, and
Yep.
it obviously includes all universities. And I think is it public educational institutes, you said?
It basically covered anyone with with 50 or more employees who had a federal contract in excess of $50,000. So essentially, any university with a federal contract or grants would be covered, and lots of other entities. And so it was supposed to have ultimately figured out, supposed to have the same rights as women, minorities, and the disabled. But at Ohio State University, my employer at the time, they didn't see it that way.
So what was your, it was difficult to understand what your reaction and how you felt about that, to find that they'd kind of sort of opted out of a federal law. You were now going to have to sort of right that wrong in your own eyes, I think it's fair to say.
Well, it was, truthfully, it probably had as much to do with getting even with 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 my employer at the time, as much as anything else. So it probably wasn't all as conscientious as I would like it to be, and but it was clear, and ultimately we figured out they were truly discriminating in employment against Vietnam veterans, against Vietnam era veterans. It covered anybody who served in the military during the Vietnam era, whether they were in country in Vietnam or not. And the university was clearly, ultimately found to be discriminating against them. So it was a matter of trying to right a wrong at my institution, and along the way, I figured out that there were lots of Vietnam era veterans who were being treated really, really badly at the university. And as I mentioned, when in 91 it became newsworthy and wound up with an article in the Columbus newspaper that I had filed this federal complaint back, and that it was in the works. Uh, a newspaper article came out with a big picture of me in it as the individual who had filed a complaint against the university. And in the next month, I had 6 different African American individuals, employees on campus, uh, stop me and encouraged me to pursue this. And all 6 of them told me they lost their affirmative action rights as African Americans when the university found out they were Vietnam veterans. And these were all 6 were in country Vietnam veterans, and they all encouraged me to go after them. So it was a significant. I mean, the level of discrimination was not trivial. They were supposed to be hiring new employees at the level that they were employed, that they existed in the civilian workforce. At that time, the civilian workforce in Ohio, I think it was 6.4% were Vietnam era veterans. There was one year when it was a point something, 0.6%, 0.2% of the new hires. And this is at all levels. It's not faculty, it's custodial workers, it's maintenance workers, it's administrators, it's everything else that they brought in. So they were not uh, hiring or employing at the level they were supposed to.
So the obvious question to ask you here is, why was that happening? What was going on?
Yeah. The only thing I can say is that it has to be targeted discrimination against them. There can be no other reason. And we actually did some digging in 1987 when this federal law started. It was 74 when the law came into place. 87, they started requiring all federal contractors to file what was called a Vets 100 report that would report the number of new hires that they made for the previous year and the number of those employed of their total employees who were Vietnam era veterans. We found other universities that had, I think in one case it was like 40 some Vietnam era veterans employed when they filed their first report. I think it was actually in 88, not 87. And 3 years later, they employed 0. They terminated any that were working for them. I mean, so this was not something isolated to Ohio State University. It was other universities in Ohio and across the country. It boggles the mind. It makes no sense.
So why were the universities discriminating? Why were the staff there discriminating, do you think?
Oh, yeah. Well, let me see. If I get a bolt of lightning out of the blue, I can answer that one. So,
Well, you do put it in your book. That's why I'm asking you.
I know. Uh, Ultimately, as you have figured out from my book, I sort of identified along the way what those who are causing the problems that I experienced when I came back. and those that were continued to create these sorts of problems. And number one on the list were what I defined as socialist loving intellectuals. And they are far and away the number one. So the university faculty elites are the prime source of this stuff. And the problem is they then train all of the other levels that go out, because number two on my list, uh, screw the public profiteers, also known as politicians and bureaucrats. Uh, they are trained, they get political science taught at the universities. So the sort of biases and whatnot that they have are sort of carried across into that group. Uh, then you've got your mass media manipulators. We've already talked about the journalists and whatnot out there. The universities train them. Uh, then there's just all your zealots, your anti-military, anti-authority zealots that are out there. Well, they're made up of a lot of these other sectors, but they're also a lot of students and people out of work and others that they just sort of organize to be out in the streets protesting. Did back during the war and are again today, in my mind. And then the last group I had was sanctimonious amoral moralists. A little too long a title, but it's basically the Hollywood types who like to preach and that they're better than thou when all they do is read a script that somebody else wrote. But you like to be out there. But so the first two on that list were my tactical, or my not my tactical, my whatever strategic threats, then the tactical, and then the worthless threats at the end. So anyhow, but it's the universities that I found at the core of all of this in this country.
And what is the legacy of all of that? How does that still affect veterans today? I mean, obviously, when this fight is by no means over at this point either, but does this still affect people, do you think?
I think it does. I truly do. I don't know that it's as bad today, but universities are these temples that very few people from the outside get in. Uh, uh, I knew a few years ago that places were in trouble when I was giving a new faculty orientation, and I talked to it was a husband and wife that were just coming in and talking to them, and well, what's your background? Their parents were both faculty members at universities, and you go, what? You're getting people with no real world experience that your parents were faculty members, now you're faculty members. Uh, Universities have become so inbred, in my view, and it's not total by any means, but it's pretty pretty much across the spectrum. Probably more in the arts, humanities, and social sciences than in the hard sciences, physical sciences, biological sciences. But it's out there, and truthfully, I believe that's probably the case in other countries as well, not just the U.S. Just my 2 cents.
So you talked about this idea of coming home. You didn't feel like you'd come home. At this point, I think you said you got the Department of Justice involved in what's going on at Ohio of this, where they're not, the affirmative action is not happening. Is that right?
It was the Labor Department's enforcement branch that came in, and ultimately, when the war in the Persian Gulf broke out in 91, 92, when it was sort of heating up in 91, it became newsworthy enough, and that's why a whole bunch of articles came out in the local paper about my complaint that I'd filed some time back, and it put enough pressure, and there was enough congressional pressure from legislators in Ohio on the Department of Labor. They finally came in and investigated and did find the university in violation of federal law, a number of points of federal code. And the one that I will always remember, that on the campus, there was an atmosphere of harassment, intimidation, and coercion against military veterans generally. And so not just Vietnam or Vietnam era veterans. That was just the general atmosphere on campus. And so this is not something trivial, and it like I say, it sort of put an end to my research career, but so be it. I
I
found
mean,
life in administration.
I think it's, in this country, and maybe some of our listeners, watchers can comment on this, but I think we often in the UK look at how veterans are treated in the US, and it's quite a favourable experiences. And there are, obviously it's a different culture, but often I've heard it compared as being a better experience. You obviously have the Office of Veterans Affairs, and things are set up all very differently. So I think to hear what you've just said about harassment and intimidation is really quite surprising, especially when you're talking all the way through to the 90s as well.
Yeah, yes, yes, and while I don't think that's out there in a covert manner anymore, I would be willing to bet that there's still an undercurrent at most U.S. universities. Uh, Fortunately, not at my current one that I'm transitioned to. When I came here in '94, it was my military service was welcomed. We have an Army base just a few miles down the road, which probably helped. And there's a lot of military people in town, and so even the faculty members here have sort of interacted over the years with military folks. So, but was kind of a rare exception, I think, to most other places, because we had data from a lot of different places across the U.S., coast to coast, where these sorts of problems existed. So and I think there's still an undercurrent at most of them.
Do you think you finally come home?
Oh, no, I did. Uh, it took a long time, and truthfully, it had to happen here as much as anywhere else, that I had to feel, and it took a very spiritual place down in the mountains of New Mexico for me to find it, and I sort of wrap up the book with what it was like finding that place, and finally wrapping everything up and making sense of everything. And part of the reason I hadn't felt welcome before this, so this was 2001 on Memorial Day when my book ends. Uh, it was I finally was able to put everything in order in my head,
Mm.
that I could come to grips with how things were happening. It's not that I believe things were solved and that everything is perfect, but I at least resolved the battles that I needed to resolve, and I could from that point forward at least continue to fight for the stuff which I've done in Washington and elsewhere. Continue to try to raise these issues and keep the issues out there. But it's no, I am. But that's something I had to come to grips with myself, and I think it's something every individual veteran has to come to grips with. And it's done most easily around other veterans, others who have served, and somehow you have to open up a lot of cans of worms in the process. I figured out it's not easy to lay your guts out there for everybody to look at,
No, no.
all of your weaknesses and all of your shortcomings, but I also decided it was needed.
Mm.
So
So tell me a little bit about this place in New Mexico, this spiritual place, because it does feature quite prominently in your book, doesn't it?
it is. It's the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. It was built by a family in honor of their son, David Westfall, who had died in Vietnam. They used his insurance money and a lot of their savings. And so it was the Westfalls built this in honor of him. It is this swept wing chapel that is truly awesome. As I describe in the book, my wife and I were on our first really vacation alone with our daughter out to the Four Corners region. Saw some of the most beautiful parts of this country one could ever see. The Grand Canyon, Monument Valley, all these great places. Even my wife will say the most awe-inspiring thing on that trip was discovering this Vietnam Veterans Memorial, the Swept Wing Chapel. We walked into that, there was a presence there like I've never felt anywhere in my life. My brothers were there. I'm tearing up talking about it.
Mm.
It is just a fantastic place that a lot of healing happened there. So and it was, like I say, a family that built it. It's now Victor Westfall has passed away. They have one other son, and he was on a foundation and a group that helps with some funding, but it's now been taken over by the state, New Mexico Department of Veterans Affairs. It's being run by the state, but I advise any veteran of any era to go visit that in northern New Mexico. It's up in the mountains at 8,000 I don't know, 200 feet or something like that. It's a gorgeous place. Like I say, there's a lot about it in the book, and it was a healing place for me, and it got me where I needed to be.
Hmm. I think, from our experience of talking to veterans, everyone finds a different path, don't they? Everyone finds a different
Yes,
way of doing that.
yes, they do. It's just I've encountered so many veterans there at the memorial at various events who will swear by what that memorial has meant to them. And those who lost individuals in Vietnam, family members have been able to go there. It's probably not the same with Victor Westphal gone. He was the most healing individual I've ever experienced in my life. Very anti-war. It was originally the Peace and Brotherhood Chapel that he named it, but he welcomed everyone, and it's an awesome place. But you need to find a place and a surrounding a gathering of individuals that can help get through some of these things because you can't do it alone.
Hmm.
Figured that out. So
Do you stay in contact with the people you served with?
uh, I wish I could say yes at the level I would like. With two, I really do. I finally, a few years ago, managed to track down my lieutenant, Lieutenant Inyard, aka Lieutenant Rock, from Vietnam, and he and I, uh, we drink a toast together every year on Groundhog Day, sort of the our first real big battle together that we served in and lost a lot of our brothers there. And so I'm in touch with him, and I'm also in touch with one of the guys I went to the NCO school with. The NCO school was only around during the Vietnam War. I was one of the six out of 168 that came out as an E6. Steve came out as an E5. I'm still in touch with him. The third member of our group died in Vietnam, and we drink a toast to his death on August 2nd when he died.
Hmm.
It's as a remembrance, but it's not. There are others that I wish I could find. I wish I could find James Russell, but there are a lot of James Russells in Los Angeles, California, and he was our radio operator. But anyhow, it's wish there were more, but it's very meaningful being in contact with those that I am in contact with.
Well, that's the important thing, isn't it? It's not about
Yes,
quantity, is it?
yes, it's invaluable. Absolutely.
Cool, thank you. So if anyone in our audience have any questions, please, please, please put them in the Q&A. We do have one from Ron, well, so a comment from Ron here. It's not your fault. If the do-gooders want to let loose, do it at your government, not a soldier. He asks, did you take drugs? And this is probably another trope you might want to address to
Sure.
help you fight or just get through. My poor memory of that time about Vietnam was the TV showing Smash and Jimi Hendrix music. Obviously, that's
Yes, yes, yeah.
I
No,
don't. I mean, obviously, I wasn't alive to watch the TV there, but I can imagine that's what it was like.
yeah, and the answer is no. And I talk about this in the book of as far as drugs. Uh, and I didn't know this at the time. I found out about it later when one of the individuals in our platoon did smoke pot, passed out on guard duty when we were way out in the Tules, spread out really thin. Number of us could have died as a result. And I found out about this after he got violently ill and wound up being medevaced out because others in his squad, where he fell asleep, told him what was going to happen to him the next time we were in a firefight because they couldn't have anybody smoking pot, drinking booze. You did not do it. You needed to be alert around the clock. You'd be out in the field with 5 to 7 guys on ambush patrol uh, without hardly any sleep. The last thing you needed was something to put you to sleep and whatnot. So that was portrayed on the news as sort of the norm over there. Certainly not in the infantry. And my view is, including of some of the movies that portrayed that as the truth, that was by those who came back having done that in Vietnam, and they want everybody to believe that was the truth, and it is not. It was not. And I am absolutely certain of that. There's no way the officers and NCOs would have allowed it to go on because all those folks wanted to stay alive, as did all of the troops, and they knew it. They knew what would happen if you're out of it. Now, when we're back in base camp, listening to loud music and stuff, that absolutely a lot of that going on. So,
Okay. Ron also says here, our guest Ronnie, I'll call him actually.
okay.
This is from a UK his perspective. It seemed a pointless war. What do you think? What did you think? Did you think it was a waste of US lives? Sorry, I'm trying to read, but I'm paraphrasing that. What were
Yeah.
your thoughts on that?
Uh, and truthfully, and I hope you read the book and you'll get a better, longer answer to this. But I truly, when I was there, I was convinced the cause was worth fighting for. I was sufficiently convinced of that. I was willing to give my life, if need be, for it. And when you make peace with your maker in combat, which I think is not uncommon, you almost have to if you're going to be able to function as a unit the way you need to. I'm convinced all of my other brothers did the same. I was convinced when I was there that it was worth the cause was worth it as it was prosecuted, as it was handled. It turned out not to be. But as you will discover if you read my book, I went through a rather shocking episode at one point when I had this realization. Did I just convince myself of that because it was a likely outcome that I was going to die there? And it was this earth-shattering. Uh, that was that was sort of when the PTSD issues were sort of taking off, or when they really hit. It was this shocking thing, and realizing, holy mackerel! And I spent a long, long time reading and studying everything I could find on Vietnam, every book that was written about it, for it, against it, neutral on it. I went through materials like you can't believe. And in the end, I came back to the same place that I started, that yes, it was a cause worth fighting for and dying for, as it was prosecuted by the US. And as it turned out, it was not. Uh, and I didn't realize this, but a guy who served in Vietnam in 65 and 75, Joe Gilmartin, who taught a war course on Vietnam at Ohio State, said basically in this war course that in 72, the war was essentially won. Had it been pressed at that point, the North Vietnamese were ready to give up in 72 after the bombing that happened. And anyhow, it wound up 75. Various laws that were passed in the US, the Case Church Amendment, there couldn't be any activity in or over South Vietnam, so we couldn't provide air support in 75 when North Vietnam invaded with all the Russian and Chinese assets. And the South Vietnamese fought very valiantly at the end, but in the end lost. But you then think about all the boat people that happened after that, all of the South Vietnamese, and it was probably in the millions who tried to leave because of how bad it was. They knew it was going to be bad, and it was even worse. So there's a lot going on there, and a lot you need to think about. And I still believe it was a worthy cause. As it turned out, it was worth 58,000 American soldiers' lives and 8 nurses' lives. No, but we were there for the right reasons to begin with.
And the whole reason why the US got involved, I mean, as you say in your book, it goes back to, post-war, post-World War II, doesn't it? In terms
Yes.
of, French Indochina and how
Yep.
that
Yep.
process happened. And obviously with Kennedy being assassinated and various
Yep.
presidential changes, policy kept changing a lot, didn't it?
It did, but it really was Truman who started way, way back then as providing support. There was a time during his administration, a third, I think it was a third, shouldn't be banging on my desk here. It was a third of the foreign aid went to Vietnam. There was a period in there anyhow around that time, and so he was pushing it. Eisenhower was supporting what was going on over there. Was not willing to send troops when the French were about to lose the country over there, but basically put together the principles that then were followed after that by Kennedy and Johnson. So it wasn't something taken on in a trivial manner, at least. So.
Mhm. When the evacuation of Saigon happened, what impact did that have on you?
I don't know. Actually, I do know. Uh, I had basically, I knew it was coming. Uh, I didn't follow it that much. It was sort of once once I got through 1970, and then I went to graduate school, and then into doing a postdoc for 4 years after that. I basically shut out the world. And it's not that the news wouldn't hit me now and then. There'd be something on. We didn't watch the nightly news, and anything related to the war, I just turned off. And so it wasn't like I really saw it happening. I learned a lot more about it in Joe Gilmartin's course, and he was one of those flying evacuation helicopters off of the embassy. And his was one of those helicopters, a Jolly Green Giant, that he was so overloaded when he landed on the carrier the last time, the strut broke and they had to push his helicopter overboard. So I learned a lot about it after the fact, but I really wasn't following it at the time. So,
Okay, thank you.
yeah.
Anonymous attendee asked, was there any help for veterans to adjust to normal life, even just a briefing and training or even access to phone support? I don't know what would be available back then, but when you left, where you said, right, if you've got any challenges, ring this number kind of approach, was there anything like that?
Not that I recall. I had, because of the fact that I left with shrapnel in my left lung, that's still in there. Also found out they didn't get all the shrapnel out of my right arm. I still have a piece in there that they supposedly took out, but I had to go to the VA, Veterans Administration, for some treatment initially and a rating. Got all of 10% disability for my shrapnel in my left lung. That was back then about the only support thing that was there that we knew about. And the thing I figured out after my visits there, the last thing I wanted to do was go back to the VA for anything.
Mm.
So there may have been, but it wasn't well known, and I certainly didn't pursue it. So probably should have, but didn't.
So pretty much the only support you had is the people you serve with or fellow veterans of
Yes,
Vietnam.
and as it turned out later, once in 1980, when I joined the Veterans of Foreign Wars organization, and later the Disabled American Veterans, the Military Order of the Purple Heart, and other sort of entities like that, I should have joined them earlier. That probably would have helped as well, because that at least you're around other veterans from other eras and other that with similar experiences, and sometimes just surrounding yourself by those who have gone through some similar things, or even if they haven't, isn't quite the same. It's still brothers and sisters who will identify with what you've experienced, and it helps you heal. So.
Mm. So if there are any other questions from the audience, please put them in the Q&A. Are you still fighting this fight, Ron? Is this, or or are you going to retire?
Well, I am retired. I finally, at 78, retired from my position here at the university. So it took me a little long to get around to doing that. And it was since then that I managed to get the book published, which is kind of a big deal for me. And this is my first ever podcast. So hopefully I'm not messing it up too badly.
You're doing very
Uh,
well, Ron. You're doing very well. Very
okay.
articulate.
Okay. Um, I still do what I can. It's the sort of thing I was on some Agent Orange federal committees going way back.
Sorry, Ron,
Uh,
just explain what Agent Orange is for people because they may not know.
okay. Okay. Yep. Okay. Agent Orange was a defoliant that was sprayed a lot in South Vietnam, and it was it was sprayed everywhere. There were other varieties of it. There was Agent Blue and some others, but Agent Orange was the predominant one. But it was to basically knock down the growth of any vegetation. And so if you went into any of those areas, you were exposed to it, but also all of the base camps were soaked down with Agent Orange. So you didn't want anything growing in or near the base camp. And so anyone who was stationed in Vietnam was exposed to Agent Orange. And it has been shown to cause lots and lots of cancers and birth defects for people who have kids and peripheral neuropathy, lots and lots of issues and problems with it. And because I was doing cancer research, I got called to serve on a national oversight committee of a big federal study that was ongoing on Agent Orange, and even that was an eye opener. I was on two times, 95 to 99. Then they threw me off because I was causing too much trouble. They put me back on in 2002 because they couldn't find anybody else who would cause trouble. And I was on until it ended in 2006. But from 95 to 99 at the meeting, and this has been going on, this was a 25-year prospective study of any of those who had sprayed Agent Orange. So the air crews that handled it and sprayed it. And so they were studying all of the health effects of these air crews, the ranch hand. It was Operation Ranch Hand that sprayed this stuff. It was in 99. So the study had been going on for years and years, ended in 2005, final report in 2006. Been going on for many years. In 1999, we found out for the first time that 1/3 of the control group for that study were Air Force personnel who were stationed in Vietnam, meaning they were exposed to Agent Orange. The base camp they were in was soaked down with it, which meant 1/3 of it, of those in the control group, were bogus. And so the Air Force's answer to this was, because the principal investigator, who was a contractor that they hired, did some analyses without that 1/3 and found out the cancer rates went way up through the roof when that 1/3 was out. It was kind of an ugly circumstance. This never should have happened, but they fired him. And in the end, in 2006, when they filed their final report, the final report included the 1/3 in the control group, so all the statistics were lower than they should have been as far as incidence of cancer and disease, because they argued this was how the study was designed, so we had to follow it to fruition. I've done science for a long time. You change the course when you need to. And I wound up being interviewed on Ted Koppel on Nightline the last week he was on TV over here about that. And as an interesting aside, a couple of weeks later, the president of my university got a letter from the two Air Force colonels who had designed the study demanding that I be fired because I was calling into question their integrity. He didn't, so I survived that. But the studies that have been done have been pretty bad, and I hope they are better in the UK when they've looked at these sorts of things.
I wouldn't count on it.
I wouldn't either. And that's why I wanted to bring that up, that these are issues and that individuals, you need to find individuals that will fight these battles and will carry these things forward. Because I had done cancer research, Admiral Zumwalt, who oversaw the ocean operations in the Delta in Vietnam, I became friends with Admiral Zumwalt, and he's the one that got me on these committees and whatnot. And his son died of cancer, was in the riverine forces and died of cancer 20 some years after being in Vietnam. And the Admiral blamed himself because he had ordered the spraying. And so the one thing I pointed out to him, that the casualty rate went from 70% in the riverine forces to 10% after the spraying. And so his son may have lived appreciably longer as a result. And so at the time, it was the right decision. You don't know all these outcomes till after the fact.
No, and many, many years later as well.
Many, many years later, yeah.
A couple of other comments from our audience. Grant says, thank you very much for your talk, Ron. Ronnie, says, you mentioned it, if you were terrified at all, what did you think of the tunnel war? So what he's asking about, I think your phrase in your book was, what was it like living in Vietnam?
I mean, we were in the field almost the whole time I was there. And so we would sometimes be in a small fire support base, but we would then go out on ambush patrol at night. So the 3.5 months I was there, we were only back in a base camp, a big one once. So it was pretty much life in the field. You were either on perimeter guard in this base camp, or you were out on ambush patrol at night. Uh, would I say you were constantly in fear? I don't think I would. You were constantly alert. Uh, I I am still in awe of the level at which your senses can operate when they need to. The stuff you can smell, feel, sense, whatever, hear, see, it's just amazing. Everything is working at 110%. And one example I use in the book, I was asleep one night next to the radio on guard. We were out in the boonies, and rockets were being going overhead, fired from Long Bend all night. And all of a sudden, I sat straight up, wide awake, and I didn't know why. It took me a second to figure it out. Two rockets had gone over the other way, and I was sufficiently conscious and thinking that I knew they went the other way, and it woke me up. It it was unreal the level at which you could operate with almost no sleep, and if you got 5 minutes of sleep, you slept. So we probably average. I figure I averaged 2 to 4 hours sleep a night the 3.5 months I was there, and then you doze any minutes you had whenever you could. But I don't. I can't. There was a time that you'll read the book, you'll find out when I truly experienced fear. And it's not that there wasn't that level of anxiety and whatnot, but it wasn't like you went around terrorized. You were doing what you were trained to do, and you operated, and you were always alert and on watch and ready for anything to happen anytime.
Thank you. Francis says, excellent talk, thank you. Do you think returning Iraq and Afghanistan veterans have received the support they needed? Or they need, for that matter?
My honest guess would be no. Uh, I, and it's not. I think we're not back where we were then. And clearly, I think all societies, your society, our society, are better since Vietnam. And you guys weren't there, but the Aussies were, and others were. I think things are better generally, but I suspect, and I don't know, but I suspect we have over 20 veterans a day committing suicide in this country. I think it's 22 a day, roughly, these days. That should not happen. And that tells me they're not getting the support they need. And so I truly believe this is true everywhere, that the veterans are not getting the level of support they should have, the level of support they deserve, because in this country right now, it's only 1% of the people in this country have served in the military of the population. It's a pretty small number. And the other 99% may be supportive, but if you haven't lived it, you don't know what the needs really are. And I don't think they always provide them. So.
That's the end of the questions, Ron. I'd just like to thank you so much for agreeing to come on the podcast. It's been a fascinating insight. I'm sure I've just seen, Les has said, a most insightful talk. Thank you. Enjoy your retirement.
I appreciate that. So, and I will try.
Well, do stay in touch, and I will speak to you again soon, hopefully.
Sounds very good. I'll look forward to it.